Well, it's all downhill after that. Thank you, Alan. I didn't know who that guy was, but anyway. I want to talk about something very simple, which is the idea that we all seem to think it's important that we talk about things that hurt us. And I just think it's interesting to ask the obvious question, why would we do that? And what happens? Why is it helpful? Is it ever not helpful? And so on. But first I want to begin with a story, and it seems it's great to be here. This department means an enormous amount to me. I started in 1970 in UCD in medicine, and I'm going to come to that as to how I ended up in psychology. But first I need to tell you a bit about something that happened in my family in '66. My mother was a patient, but very discreet lady, very private. And she was born in Cork, worked as a telephonist in what is now Fallon and Byrne, which was the Dublin Telephone Exchange. And she married in '51. I arrived along soon after, at a respectable distance. And, you know, she had her fair share of sorrows, and really probably more than what most people have to carry. And it's not important what they were. But they caught up with her in 1966, and a friend came one day and took her to a hospital. Now, it was all very strange because my father was in the left, and here my mom disappeared suddenly. And the friend said she'd be back in a few days. Well, the few days became several weeks, and it was odd to me that we couldn't go see her. But my sister had a communion, first communion, and her big brother, you know, had to look after this, me, and so we went to see her. And of course it was a psychiatric hospital, and we met in the lobby, or under the stairs, and we never went in any further. And she explained, as I'd heard, that her white blood cell count had dropped, and she was there to have that fixed. That all seemed very fine. I, you know, didn't know it was such a big thing, but anyway, I took it. And she said to me the three words which were very important. She said, "Not a word about this. Not a word." I said, "Okay." "Not a word to your father?" "Okay." He wasn't on the phone, so it was easy enough not to, but I could have written to him. "Not a word to the relatives in Cork? Not a word to the neighbours?" This was rapidly running out of people in my life. So I was already off school, and I stayed off for several more weeks. And that resulted in a very poor intercert. The thing is that about a year later, she's listening to Gay Byrne, and she hears this priest, who's an Anglican priest from London, who is called Shadvara. And Shadvara had set up this unusual service in his basement, and the service was called the Samaritans. And he would have people call in who were in trouble, who had sorrows. And those people would, you know, get some relief. And my mother listened to this, and it was a life-changing moment. And she said, "I want to meet this man." So with two other women, a year later, they finally made contact. They went over to visit him, and a year later, in '69, she founded the Samaritans in Ireland with these two women. And for 46 years, she did her weekly sessions, her volunteer rotas. But this was all very exciting, but you can imagine how novel the whole thing sounded, and we were, you know, all recruited to help in sales of work. It started out of our house. And, you know, they had to have some training. There was a bunch of people, no more than maybe 7 or 8 in the Dublin branch, and they had some training. So they brought in a psychologist to teach them how to listen. And this psychologist came in. His name is Eddie Malloy. Some of you might have heard of him. And Eddie had a reel-to-reel tape of Carl Rogers. And he would play this tape, and Carl Rogers, who patented listening and really owns empathy, and Carl Rogers, with this lady he was speaking to, she would say something that was troubling her. And he would say, he would empathize, which is to say that he reflected emotionally and cognitively back to her what she was saying. And he didn't ask her a question, and he didn't give any advice. And the entire session went like that. But there was a dramatic change in this woman through the session. Now, the training, you ask, what was the training here? Well, the training was that after every time this woman would say something, Eddie would stop the tape and ask us all to write down what our response would be. And the response was to be an empathic response. So she says, I'm feeling very down. And I would say something like, it sounds like you're feeling very down. Sounds easy to do, very, very difficult. My mother had many, many gifts, and I love her to bits, but she was always inclined to tell people what to do. And you probably know people like this. So frequently she would say something like, that sounds awful, would you not do it? And I was sitting listening to this. I should explain, I was in First Med at the time, and they thought because I might do psychiatry, this might be relevant, so I was brought in to sit in. Anyway, I'm sitting there, and after a while, Eddie picks her up and says, Phil, will you stop trying to help people? Will you just listen? And something inside me my heart just burst open with joy. I realized, oh my God, somebody sees it. This is what this woman does to me all the time. Somebody sees this. And I learned two things in that evening. I learned that psychology is something that can help, not by fixing people, but by empowering people. And secondly, I learned that psychologists are not afraid to call it, to name what's beneath the surface, but that's some hidden dynamic that's holding people back. And so I changed to psychology. There you go. Anyways, Give Sorrow words from Shakespeare. Ross comes with the news to Macduff, to Malcolm. Yes. And that Macbeth has slaughtered his wife and children. And Macduff says, give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak whispers the o'erfraught heart and bids it break. And in that moment, the need and the argument to speak became clear, but also the link to physical health became clear. And that's what we want to look at a little bit. Now, cultures throughout history have always had a way to encourage people to disclose their burdens, to talk about things, to give sorrow words. It's been in every culture. The Greeks in small villages around Greece had a designated person who was the listener, called a therapeuti, and thus we have therapists. Medicine men, medicine women, shaman, people who could be trusted and who could enable people to unburden. In the Colombian Indian tribe, they find that before they go to the healer, the physical healer, they have to make a sort of confession. It's mandatory. And our own country, at the edge of the Atlantic, where we just barely eked out an existence and where there was lots of sorrow, Peg talked about how everything that was coming dark upon us we would disclose to each other, and that would give us consolation of mind. This is deep in our history, and even if we didn't have the courage to say it, we told stories. We packaged the learning and the wisdom into stories and passed it down the generation. And artists since have been doing that, and they'll never stop. And sometimes the stories they tell give words to sorrows that none of us have the courage to admit. The artist's role is to speak at a level of truth about what is most inspiring or inspirational about people, but also what is most difficult and what is most dark, and that needs to come some ways into the light. And of course we've had confession. Maybe a lot of you guys don't even know what this is, but I do. spent a lot of time there. There were things called impure thoughts that we were never meant to entertain. When you tell people don't have impure thoughts, it's a bit like saying to you, don't think about the pink bunny on my left shoulder. Nothing pink, don't think about anything pink, no bunnies please. And you know what happens. It doesn't work. So, but every religion, Islam, Buddhism, Christian religions, Protestant, Catholic, Quaker, different maybe in times of encouraging confession, sometimes privately, it's enough, sometimes in a one-to-one, sometimes publicly, to come and to confess and give your life to Jesus. And along comes Freud. And Freud was friends with Joseph Breuer, and Joseph Breuer had a patient in the late 1890s, Anna O, and not her real name. And she was somebody that had kind of, I guess, a term we don't use anymore, but she had hysteria. So she'd have sort of paralysis of the right side, or she'd have problems drinking certain liquids. And she had a whole rake of problems. And Breuer just hypnotized her and got her to talk it out. And he said to her, I just want you to say anything that comes to your mind. And she flooded out. She called it the chimney sweep method, but she also called it the talking cure. And Freud took her on board at some point and worked with her without hypnosis. It's really interesting that when you look at the story of the woman who actually ended up on a stamp in Germany. She had real difficulties, but once the therapy stopped, she relapsed and was institutionalized for a long time, several years. She got better later on, and they discovered that she had probably a kind of epilepsy from tubercular encephalitis. So sometimes, giving sore words is not enough. Okay, but Freud started this idea that we should talk, and his notion was really that it was the pressure inside us that needed to be released, so that his therapy was really a kind of a lifting the lid of things and letting things out, okay? And this kind of took on big time in the last century. I mean, in the 60s, everybody was just gushing forth. I mean, it was counter groups and est groups and primal scream groups, which really brought it to a fine art. The people just, if they could just get it out, they could be free of neurosis. And for Arthur Janoff from Primal Scream, physical illness, that link, physical illness, he said, was a silent scream. And so it was all the more important for those with physical illnesses to let it out, okay? And the Screamers came to Ireland in Burtonport. They were living for a while in Donegal. Very vulnerable people. I watched different movie clips of them, who'd obviously had some horrendous childhood experiences. And they found a safe community, the Atlantis community, commune, which allowed them to scream regularly and drove the neighbours absolutely crazy. There's a whole lot of houses, as you can see, and they interviewed the man in that house, and he just wanted them out. He would lie in bed at night listening to screams. It wasn't easy. And we did our own screaming in Dublin in the shadow of St. Brendan's in the late 80s, because in that hospital where people never screamed, where they were extraordinarily silent and probably needed a great deal more to let things out. But the All Saints Protestant Church was a place where we would gather with Ivor Brown, and through a combination of multi-track recordings and booming at us, in the dark, as we lay on, mats, all with a minder. And if that didn't do it, you'd have a large injection of ketamine. And I had all of this, and it was all very exciting. And I screamed in a way that I never imagined I could, and haven't done since. But I'm not sure that it did anything. I mean, it let me know that I wasn't quite the person I thought I was. I thought I was kind of a gentle sort of person. And it was a really expanding awareness thing, but otherwise I'm not sure it sorted out. Anyway, all that's gone because now we have Joe. Any of this. And really, it's kind of the listener to all our sorrows and woes, and it's just enough. And it's not true. We also have AA groups, and we have other places where people patiently and honestly and painfully reveal what is most painful in their lives, and which they sense to be connected to the symptoms that they have, addiction or whatever it might be, depression, suicide. And they talk in a different way. So in some ways it's getting calmed down. I became interested in this through a man, J.W. Pennebaker, James Pennebaker. And I met James in the 90s, and he is a research psychologist who worked as a physiological psychologist for a long time, not a therapist, and it's important. But he's really interested about the way people opened up. Why? Because he used to work with people who did lie detectors. They used to kind of work on that scheme. And he told us a story that got him interested. He said, people would come for lie detection, which is about a 9 out of 10 success rate, and therefore can't be admissible as evidence. So, but they come in and they have their lie detector, and so they would get all wired up, And the idea was that, lies and tension would be detected. And what the guys would do is they'd say, I know you didn't murder that guy, but it's funny that the machine is just registering something when I ask you about, the gun, or the blood. What I'd love is, would you mind if we kind of read you this a little later? But meanwhile, if you would just go into the room down the corridor and talk to Mr. Smith, he will be able to help you get things off your chest, relax a bit, and then we'll get a better reading. And invariably, they would go down to Mr. Smith, and they would confess the whole thing. They would tell the whole thing. And then they'd come back and redo the test, and this is what got him interested. All the indicators were down. There was no tension, there was no stress. They're physiologically, that's all he was interested in. These guys were in a much better position. Now, they were facing the death penalty. They had just made a confession. And yet somehow they felt better than holding it back. So his conclusion was that, ironically, the real value of the polygraph was in bringing about confessions, and that's why they continued to use them for years. But he was interested in looking further at stress, and he has a lot of studies, and I just want to mention two because they're really interesting. And the first one is, he had the idea, well, so if somebody doesn't confide some terrible distress, it'll make them sick. So he took, and I won't go into the details of how he picked a sample, but he took a sample of women whose husbands had taken their own lives. In fact, there weren't just women, there were spouses of people who'd taken their own lives. And he took then equally spouses of people who died in an unexpected but natural way. Okay, maybe they had a car accident or something like that. And his hypothesis was, well, the suicide people won't be able to talk about it because it's so terrible. And they'll be much sicker. And he took lots of measures and all kinds of measures of illness. So two things happened. One is he found that his hypothesis was improved. Ironically, the women who are the men or the people who had been bereaved by suicide, they had lots of opportunity to talk about it. They had been to recovery groups and care groups. But the other people who had an unexpected death, they talked about it and then they didn't know what to say and they just kind of stopped talking about it. So they were much more given to rumination and having headaches and having symptoms. So he did find a connection, not quite in the way he expected, and he began to wonder, is it being able to talk about it that really matters? So he did another study, and the second one was done on 2,000 workers in the corporation, massive corporation in the States. And they were doing a big survey in the 80s about people's health. And he asked, could they include, God, don't even ask how this was possible, very intimate personal questions about whether they'd been exposed to violence, sex abuse, adversity, early death, separation in parents, marital conflict, mental illness. That was one question, and they embedded it in a whole lot of others. And then this other question was, have you talked about this? How much of a trauma was this for you, and how much have you confided this to other people? And again, what was really interesting was that he found that, without doubt, childhood sexual abuse yielded the strongest findings in terms of impact on a person's life. But that was moderated profoundly by whether people had spoken or not spoken about what happened. So the Zale Corporation. So he sorry. So what he established in his own mind. So then the next question which he got onto was what happened. But before we do that, let's look at this one, which is, why people don't connect physical and psychological symptoms. We have physical symptoms and we don't often see them signaling distress. There's something inbuilt in us which Freud catalogued very well, that wants to avoid acknowledging psychological distress. We can be sick, but we don't see the connections. Also, the connections aren't immediate. So it's not like I'm feeling very low and down because, I had a row yesterday. No, it could be because of something that happened 20 years ago. And, and these connections have now been established mainly through the adverse childhood experience studies, which again were similar. His ideas were picked up by another corporation whose name I forget, the Kaiser VHI in San Diego, who looked at their cohort of 17,000 people and asked them not just about their physical illness history, but also about their psychological histories, and found profound connections. They found that, where there was serious traumas, there was always some kind of physical connection in terms of physical illness or chronic disease problem. And the more traumas there were, the more the illnesses were present. So you can see lung disease, heart disease, all of these things were massively increased according as people were exposed to trauma. But James Pennebaker still felt that it's clear childhood traumas influence, but traumas may be insidious because people cannot talk about them. They must actively inhibit their wanting to discuss these intensely personal experiences with others. So he felt, there's something that happens when we talk. So his studies then began to look at talking, and he asked what happens when we speak about painful experiences. And he did this in very practical ways. He had people come into his lab. Important to state that he did it with college students, not clinical population. And he did it with people who came in and sat down and got wired up and then were asked to do one of two things, to talk about something deeply personal that had hurt them, trauma, or to talk about, what they did last week, or talk about something utterly superficial. And he kind of followed, he monitored their physiology and their changes, and also long-term looked at the follow-up in terms of their illness history for 6 months afterwards. Now, what he found was interesting. He found that, when people talk about painful things, they talk faster, okay? And if they're writing, they write faster. Their heart rate and blood pressure increase, quite dramatically, but later decrease. This didn't happen in the group that were just talking about superficial things. Their skin conductance decreases, which is, for a long time we thought the stress response was just getting people geared up for action. I say to you, the in-laws are coming tomorrow, and that's that sort of fight-flight response. But there's a whole other subsidiary system in terms of the stress response, which has to do with inhibiting, withholding, tightening, and trying not to act actually, and that's got to do with perspiration in the hands and the feet, which become very apparent, and you can monitor that through these galvanic skin response detectors. And what he found was there was very little of that kind of stress. People were letting go and getting lower and lower as they talked about important things, and we lose a sense of time and place. So we talk faster, we increase, and so something happens physiologically when we talk. The other thing that opens up that he was interested in is what helps us to open up. And he found that, situations that take us out of normal reality, that kind of remove us from the the normal everyday world where we're bound by ideas and rules and regulations, have a chance, they enhance the chances of us talking about personal things. So altered emotional states. You can be very anxious. You can be very drunk. You can be taking peyote like the Indians do sometimes when they're gathered around in the evening talking about the trauma they experienced that day. They would take peyote from the cactus plant, and that seemed to induce a different kind of state. There's no doubt. Unique setting. There's something about, the strangers on the train, or the therapist in an office, or the GP in his surgery, or there are unique settings that people, again, we're stepping out of the norm, and we become more open to talking. Even in a lab, he was amazed at how open we were. Low light. They literally had one people talk in one lab and then another in a darkened room with slightly subdued lighting, subdued lighting, not completely dark. And there was phenomenal differences in the rate of self-disclosure, and a powerful, accepting listener. So look at those 4 things, and what do you think of? Confession. The Catholic Church was onto something. Now, he went on to do more studies, and he was interested, do you need to talk or can we just write? And this is where I think it gets interesting, because he found that if people can even write for 10, 15 minutes, 4 days consecutively, there were just profound, and he did these with thousands of students, profound changes in their demeanor and their general mental health. As against people who are asked for 4 consecutive days to write about superficial experiences, how I find college, what I plan to do next week, what will I be when I graduate, that kind of stuff. For you, I'm sure, very important stuff, but not really what he was trying to get at. And what he found here was that, on the first day of writing, they would often tell about a traumatic episode that simply described the experience. Often out of sequence and disorganized. But day by day, as they continued to write, the episode would take on the shape of a coherent story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. We realized that people who benefit from writing were doing more than venting, which is Freud's thing. They were constructing stories. So it began to open up then that it's more than just getting things off my chest. It's that, in a sense, I'm constructing a narrative for my life. And I think Jeremy Holmes, who's really kind of championed a lot of attachment theory in the UK, says it very well when he says secure attachment is marked by coherent stories that hang together, just like the writers achieved. Insecure attachment by clinging to rigid stories, overwhelmed by unstoried experience, or being unable to find a narrative strong enough to contain the pain. It's like sometimes it's like the Jaws thing. You need a bigger boat. You need a bigger narrative to hold. You need something, a story for your life that fits your experience. And it can happen that people find themselves in spaces where they haven't got a story. Their story is too small. It can happen in a society. Brian Friel, it can happen that a whole civilization becomes imprisoned in a linguistic contour which no longer matches the landscape of experience. Or, in simpler words, people can be trapped in history and history trapped in them. And I think it's that sense of being trapped is that causes so much of the conflict we see. Certainly in young people, it's true that distress that is within but without words tends to break out in symptoms and repeated acts. And so much of that distress is hidden. So much of it is hidden behind a very cool, this is some young boy called Killian, asked to describe his mental health. And what strikes me about it is how cool the guy looks if you just see the face. But then you see all that's happening and going on. And I think I just want to make one point here as we talk about talking, and I want to say a few more words about it, but I think it's important to realize that it's not just talking, it's a relationship with somebody that really seems to matter. And just talking one time or even blowing off one time about the pain in your life is not going to cut it. It won't be enough. And what you need is continuation of relationship over time. The other thing is that neuroscience has come into play and has joined this conversation, and it's way too much to get into that. But I think, again, I just like this quote from Bruce Perry: positive experiences of relationships do not only promote good connections with others, they also assist optimal brain functioning and enhance our ability to manage our own stress levels. This applies across the life cycle. We are always interdependent, and we never cease to be. And I think that's really important, that there's no one thing. And I worked in James's for a long time, and I saw people come back again and again over the years. I saw their children come back. And there were breakthroughs at times, but nothing, and they came to terms with issues in their life. They didn't get over anything. They did. They got over problems of being very depressed and anxious, but they didn't lose anything. They didn't exorcise themselves in any way. All those memories, those traumas were still realities in their lives, and they had to live with them. And, just being able to come back and check in. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but I think the point is that therapy kicks in, I think, when people get stuck and trapped. And they can't talk. And I love Robertson Davies' description. I like him as a writer a lot, but in the Manticore, he says, the psychologist says, my job is to listen to people say things they very badly want to say, but that nobody else will understand, but are afraid no one else will understand. Nobody else will, okay, fine, you get the meaning of that. In other words, that the presence of somebody, and this again, we're going back to attachment theory, when I am secure, I can explore. When in a safe, trusting relationship, I'm able to look at things that on my own I can't look at. And I think Pennybaker's results were great, and they were marvelous, but they were ordinary people who weren't burdened, who were, for the most part, and they could benefit from a once-off opening or writing things down. But I certainly saw people who needed much more than that. But what struck me listening to them is that people would come, and I always used to think it was that I had to listen to what they were saying. And then I realized that was absolutely true. But the other thing was happening was that as they spoke, they were listening to themselves. And again, I'm just going to go back to my dear mother. She was in hospital this year earlier, and I went in to see her one evening at 7 o'clock, and she was she'd fractured her spine, so she was in the rehab in Clontarf. As I say, she attracted sorrows and difficulties, God love her. She had the hardest of times. But she was there, and I went in one day, and she seemed delighted to see me. And she said, I'm dying to see, I want to talk about something, you see. And she said to me, I think I'm ready to die. And I'm okay with that. And I feel I've done what I wanted to do. I'm 90 years of age, and I feel okay. Is that crazy? And she talked about it. Now, the real thing was that she could talk to me about those things, and she always had. We had a very close relationship. But she couldn't talk to my brother. He's a GP, and GPs don't do death. I mean, they're very bad on they don't like people. But I realized that she couldn't say those things until I arrived. But my being there had allowed her to say them, and saying them had allowed her to kind of helped her to come to terms with them. If you like, she was able to broaden her story, to open it out, I think, I was thinking all of you probably have someone in your life, hopefully, who listened to you at some point. And I want you just privately, I'm not going to ask anybody about that, but just to remember, if you can, how did that feel? What did being heard feel, or what did it mean to you? If you can just recall, don't think about it too much. Just what was the feeling when somebody got you and listened? And I think that's a very tender place in your own life. It's a very tender place in your heart, and a place that is well worth revisiting sometimes, particularly when you're on the verge of losing hope in all of humanity. It is an extraordinary, it's a very tender place, a very special gift. So how does talking help? Well, I hear myself think. I connect with what is painful. What is painful can't change until I connect with it, until I touch it. It doesn't go anywhere. So we have to touch what is painful. My GP, bastard. Okay. I went to him one day and I had most severe tennis elbow. I mean, I don't care, other people have had tennis elbow. I had the worst tennis elbow. And, and it just really hurt me. And I said to him, can you give me some steroid injections? Lots of them, No. Okay. He said, the evidence is it comes back, Okay, how about some oxycodone? That would be just great. A few oxys a bottle would be great because it'll take away all the other pains of my life. No, he wasn't going to do that. He never gave anything, I said, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to show you exactly what to do. And he says, you're going to touch where your pain is. And you're going to touch it. And you're going to feel pain. But you're not going to overdo it. So you'll do it a couple of times a day, just enough. And you massage it. And that was not news I wanted to hear. But I did it. And that was 3-4 years ago. It's never come back. And it was the worst tennis elbow. I often, when I'm teaching medical students, or particularly GP trainees, I say, that's what you do for physical pain. It's wonderful. He's a fantastic GP. What happens when somebody comes in and says, I feel sad? You run the other way, or you try to shut it down completely. It's very hard to hear somebody. Anyway, feelings that are frozen become fluid. And that's it. It flows. Anger becomes, I realize I'm old. Anxiety, I realize I'm angry. Or anger, I'm hurt. It flows. They flow. We learn to trust them again. I think about what's happened in a different way. I see it through your eyes. I hear what you're saying, and I see a different perspective. I see myself in a different way, not as the cause, not as the helpless victim, but as somebody caught up in something that I can handle if I can just find a way to think about it myself. I feel more real. That gap between my inner world and my outer world closes. And that gap is important because the wider it is, the more at risk we are. But it closes. And closure becomes possible. I learn to move on, to take it with me, with a less constricted narrative for my life. So, mental health is a story that can be told. Mental ill health is a story that's never been told. Or more correctly, mental health is a story that can be told and updated. So I have a larger vision of who I am. This is a story that, for me, captures mind-body healing, okay? One of my last stories, I think. And so this is the American Embassy in 1983 in Beirut. As you can see, the way it's designed is important to notice. And I saw a woman who was up here, okay? She was a secretary, and she was photocopying at a machine right behind that window when a bomb went off right below. And the bomb, as you see, did severe damage. She saw the white van coming in, and it blew up. And when it did, the glass shattered into 1 million pieces and came right in on her and penetrated her body, and she was absolutely cut through. But she was conscious, and she saw even worse than that. And she remained conscious for some time, and then she was unconscious and whisked off to Germany, had amazing plastic surgery, and in 1988, I was working in the States at the time, she was sent to me for PTSD. And she was beginning to have flashbacks. What had been repressed, necessarily so perhaps, disavowed, pushed away, were coming back. And she needed to assimilate those and to, in a sense, move from a story that she might have had in 1983, where bad things like that don't happen, to a story which was big enough to encompass and to fit her experience. And she came in to me, and I mentioned this, I'm using my words very carefully here. She was an attractive woman. She was in a sleeveless dress. I saw her in summer in Philadelphia, and I was really quite amazed at that, she looked so well. And she was talking, and we got to work, and we worked together for maybe 2 months. I don't think it was much longer, actually. And during the time, on one occasion, I saw some blood, and I paid no attention, mosquito bites, And then another week, I saw another little bit of blood, and another mosquito bite. But on the third occasion, when I saw blood, I said, hold on, oh my God, this woman is self-harming. So I said, I got to talk about this. Trauma, self-harm, it's not an unusual consequence. So I said to her, can I ask you about the blood? And she looked at me. And she said, Tony, it's the glass. And I said, the glass? She said, yeah, it's coming out. And I said, could they not have x-rayed that and taken it out when you were going through all that surgery? And she says, bigger, duh. Glass doesn't show up on x-ray, and it was deep tissue. But it struck me the extraordinary parallel process. The body was pushing out what was hurting, and the mind in our sessions were bringing back and pushing out memories. And the two seemed to work together, and she was delighted. So with all of that, you might say talking is obviously a wonderful thing. Why don't we do it more? Well, people don't talk to their therapists, and there's a lot of evidence for this. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but basically, people hold back all over the place. And particularly secrets of a sexual nature, or to do with inadequacy, or to do with some relationship difficulty. They hold back. And important things. And these were done with people whose sessions were taped, and they were rated for disclosure, relevant disclosures, and they were filled in questionnaires afterwards. So it was done very carefully. So we have a need to be known. All of us want somebody to know us. It's a very primal need. But we also have a fear of being known. We're afraid. And part of that is we want to hold on to a sense of self that we've crafted, and we're quite happy with, thank you very much. And I don't want this to change, so I'm not going to tell you something that could bring us into a whole new conversation about who I am. That's part of it. Another part of it, I think, is that we're afraid that if I tell you that I think I'm losing my mind, that you'll say, well, actually, glad you brought that up, because you've got all the signs. Let's book you in now. So there's that fear. There's also a fear of not being accepted, a fear of burdening the other person. It's very hard to say things, and if I let my shadow out, it might destroy me, but it might also upset you, and I care about you. And this is really interesting, because sometimes we think, well, the longer you know somebody, the more you'll talk to them. But with therapists, that's not the way it works at all. Because when I have seeing a therapist and I'm getting on terribly well with them, I want to hold on to that. I don't want to mess that up and tell them that I've done something awful sexual thing, or some awful, evil in my life. I've stolen or hurt someone, or, So why would I do that? Because we have a nice relationship and you accept me, and this is the only place that happens, so I don't want to mess that up. So that often people who are longer in therapy are holding back the most. Shame. And the other thing is the limits of language. It's just really hard to find words to say things. And young people particularly struggle with what they want to say and what they have no words for. I love this quote from Flaubert. None of us ever express the exact nature of his sorrows. Human speech is like a cracked kettle on which we tap crude rhythms for bears to dance to, while we long to make music that will melt the stars. Isn't that gorgeous? Yeah. The other one I love is, I won't use words again. They won't mean what I meant. They don't say what I said. They're just the crust of the meaning with realms underneath, never touched, never stirred, never even moved through. If language were liquid, it would be rushing in. Instead, here we are, in a silence more eloquent than any words can be. Suzanne Vega. Language is so limited, and it's why we need music and art and other means to say what we're trying to say and what we may need to say. Right, I'm nearly done, guys. I hope I haven't exhausted you all. Oh, dear, dear. Okay, good. 3 things. We've talked about grief a lot tonight. All the stories are about loss. And I just want you to notice that as I was preparing this, it struck me that grief in our life, and I bet I could go around everybody in this room, is a catalyst for what? For growth. You know, if I go back to why you're doing what you're doing, I bet I'll find a story where there's loss, right? And I think it's very important that we see sorrows as reflecting not just tragedy in someone's life, but also a chance to move through their life and become even more human, more alive. They're not the end of the road. I think we have to hold that lens because that's how we got here, and that's what we're doing. I think the other thing is that when we give sorrow words, we need to be heard. And, you know, it's interesting. You look around the world and you look at Me Too and you look at homelessness and women's rights and gender politics and youth mental health and God knows what else, Kavanaugh versus Ford, you know, and you realize there are so many loud voices and they're screaming at each other. They seem to be raising the volume and not hearing each other and not wanting to hear each other, seems to me. And I think that there's not, because real hearing, real listening, I think is hard work. It requires tolerance. It requires patience. It requires empathy. But it requires you stay with somebody and you really listen. And for that moment, you just put aside your own issues and your own prejudice and you listen. And I think that's a rare gift that we give someone. And I think when we experience it, it's beautiful. When we can give that to someone, it may be the best thing we can possibly offer. I worry about listening in the health service and the mental health service. And as I look across, Alan mentioned, I've been involved in policies. And what strikes me as missing, it's not we need more of this or less of that or more, you know, it's actually our medication. It's much more we need to engage with the person before us. And in a world where, you know, brief intervention is favored over anything that has depth or anything that allows the shadow to emerge, the shadow in people that longs to be integrated but has to be heard if it's before it can be integrated. Or that, you know, just values symptom relief temporarily over any deep understanding, self-understanding. We're in a world where listening is an endangered art form. It's not a given that it happens, even among psychologists. You know, I remember a registrar, very unfair, but she came with lunch, we were all sitting around, and way back when I was an arrogant young psychologist, and she sits down, she said, "Oh my God, I've been talking to people for the last 24 hours, I'm exhausted." And I said to her, "You should try listening." Now that was mean, but there is a sense that it's also true, and I would say that to my own, it is true. Anyway, there's one thing for certain, you guys have been listening, and I hope I haven't given you too much grief. Thank you.